This video lecture will focus on the major events and impacts of European imperialism in China. Imperialism in China resulted in two major world events, the first being the Opium War from 1839 to 1842, and the second being the Boxer Rebellion, which occurred in the late 1800s and into the early 1900s. At the same time that Europeans were competing to carve up and colonize Africa, and while the British were colonizing India, several European countries began to focus their efforts on controlling the trade relationship between the Chinese and Europeans. Their attempts to control and change this relationship are what ultimately caused the tensions that led to the Opium War and Boxer Rebellion. Prior to 1800, China had a very successful trade partnership with Europeans. They were able to trade three major goods: silk, porcelain, and tea to European countries in exchange for gold and silver. This trade relationship resulted in China benefiting from trade and having what is known as a trade surplus, where they were sending more goods out of their country than they were bringing in goods from European countries. And since they were trading for gold and silver, it was very profitable for China to trade these goods. Since China had a trade surplus, the Western nations of Europe had a trade deficit. They were buying more things from China than they were selling to the Chinese, and thus they were losing money in their trade relationship. This is what caused Europeans to try and change the trade partnership to make it more in their favor. One country that had a significant impact and was able to change the trade relationship between Europeans and the Chinese was the British. From their new colony in India, the British were able to acquire the plant opium, which was used to make a variety of substances, including addictive drugs. Opium is similar to heroin in its addictive properties and became a good that Europeans, specifically the British, tried to trade in exchange for silk, tea, and porcelain. If they were able to trade opium instead of gold and silver, they would then have a trade surplus. As more and more opium was traded to the Chinese became addicted to it, and this ultimately caused a problem between the British traders and the Chinese. This conflict between European traders and the Chinese is what ultimately sparked the Opium War in 1839. As the Chinese became more and more frustrated with the problems of addiction as a result of their citizens using opium, they made an effort to stop British merchant ships from bringing opium into their country. Chinese warships attacked the British and sunk their ships, which sparked the beginning of the Opium War. The war lasted from 1839 until 1842, but the Chinese were fairly quickly and fairly easily defeated because their weapons and technology were inferior compared to the British, who had better ships and more powerful weapons. In 1842, as the war wound down, the Chinese and the British signed a treaty known as the Treaty of Nanjing to end the war and resolve the conflict. In the Treaty of Nanjing, the British got a variety of benefits, while the Chinese were punished fairly harshly for the events of the Opium War. The Chinese were first forced to pay an indemnity, or a payment for the losses during the war. China was required to pay for all of the opium that was lost when they sunk ships, as well as the cost of replacing the ships that had been destroyed during the Opium War, and additional costs to pay for weapons and supplies for the British Army. This indemnity amounted to a huge amount of money that took China many, many years to pay off. Second, the British got control of the island and port city of Hong Kong. Hong Kong is in the southern part of China as you can see in this blown up image, and became a very valuable trading port for the British, in which they were able to ship goods into and out of China from 1842 up until the year 2000, when Hong Kong was officially returned to the Chinese government and became part of China again. Lastly, British citizens and traders living in China got to live under a situation known as extraterritoriality. This meant that British citizens and merchants had the right to ignore Chinese laws and live under British laws, even though they were living in China. If any crimes were committed or laws were broken by British citizens, they were tried in a British court instead of a Chinese court, where they often got significantly better treatment and less punishment. This treaty was ultimately extremely unfair to the Chinese and did nothing more than to punish them and cause further unhappiness with the British. After the Treaty of Nanjing was signed, China slowly became weaker and weaker over the next 40 to 50 years. Eventually, China loses a series of wars, including the Sino-Japanese War in 1894 and 1895. And ultimately, China was carved up into a series of what are known as spheres of influence. These spheres of influence allowed European countries such as Britain, France, Germany, Japan, and Russia to ultimately claim parts of China's territory as their exclusive place to trade. As you can see in this map, each country claimed a section of China, and anybody living in that section was forced to trade and follow the rules established by the foreign country that controlled their land. As you can see in the key down at the map, the yellow section of China was ultimately controlled and claimed by France. The brown sections, here and here, as well as the port city of Hong Kong, were claimed and controlled by the British. And Germany, Japan, and Russia each claimed territory that was beneficial to them as their sphere of influence. Each one of these territories was controlled by the Europeans, who received all of the benefits of trade and further angered the Chinese living in those areas. As a result of these spheres of influence, the Chinese developed significant anti-foreign feelings towards Europeans. These feelings of hatred would ultimately lead to the Boxer Rebellion, which you will learn about in a future assignment. Once the Boxer Rebellion was over, the Chinese are going to be forced to westernize or modernize their country by copying and adapting their way of life to a way that was similar to Europeans and other Western countries. China would eventually develop a constitutional monarchy similar to what many European countries had, getting rid of their emperor, which had been the traditional leader of China for thousands of years. And this new government would be based on three principles. It would be based on Chinese nationalism and trying to remove foreign influence from their country. It would be based on democracy. And it would be based on economic security for all Chinese. The idea behind this new government was to make the Chinese people proud of their country again, make them want to support their country and the new government that was created, and ultimately to have them not work with foreign nations, trying to remove the presence of foreign countries from mainland China. These events would carry on through World War I and into World War II, until eventually China had a communist revolution in the 1840s, which turned the country into a communist country and has helped establish China as the nation it is today. Overall, the impact of European imperialism in China was fairly negative for the Chinese. The Chinese lost control of significant chunks of their territory. Their citizens were forced to change their way of life and culture to adapt to what Europeans wanted, and in many cases, the relationship between Europeans and the Chinese resulted in benefits for Europeans and was harmful to the Chinese and their way of life.